Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and today I'm joined by Shawn Corcoran, CEO of Men for Life. On today's episode, Shawn shares his moving story, losing a child to abortion, the toll that this took on his life, and how he eventually found healing and has since become an advocate for preborn children. Shawn also offers a great perspective on the impact that abortion has on men, how men are essential to the pro-life movement, and the particular ways that they are gaslit and attacked by pro-abortion activists. It's a fascinating episode. I really enjoyed talking about these topics with Shawn, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. As always, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of our audio platforms, please pause and leave us a 5-star review and subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on Rumble or YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that you can get new episodes every Thursday. Without further ado, please welcome Shawn Corcoran to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn.
Hey, thanks, Colleen. Thanks for having me today.
It's wonderful to have you on. We had Jacob Tonglet from Men for Life on a couple of years ago, and it's great to welcome back someone else from your organization. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Jacob has been with Men for Life for a very long time, much longer than I have. So I think we've evolved a lot since, in the last couple of years. So hopefully we can offer a fresh perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And in that point, Jacob was talking specifically about the effects of pornography on men regarding abortion and all of that. So this will definitely be a more personal story today. So yeah, could you just start by sharing your own story with abortion? Because we've actually never highlighted a story of a man who has experienced an abortion in his past on the show. So if you could just begin by sharing that.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I would like to just start by saying, while my story may seem extreme, and it is, there's a lot of connections, and it's not as uncommon as it may seem when people hear it. I think that, and we can get into that after I share my story, but I think that it's very common for men who lose a child to abortion to face that with a lot of unhealthy behaviors. And so in my perspective, or in my life, I fought against the abortion. I was 19 years old. I was away at college, and I had a girlfriend who came to my room, and she said, "Hey, I'm pregnant." And in my mind, having grown up in the Catholic Church and in Catholic school, we knew what abortion was at the time. This is before the internet was really anything more than a place you went to download music very, very slowly, right? Like the internet wasn't anything to think of. Certainly there weren't people shouting their abortions. It was something that people did in silence, in the shadows, in secret, and just kind of kept it to themselves. And so when she told me this, my mind immediately went to, we're going to have a baby. What does that mean for how this is going to affect our lives? And as I was working through these things verbally, she stopped me and she said, "Well, I'm not going to have the baby. I'm going to have an abortion." And because I didn't know anybody that had ever had an abortion, because I didn't know that that was something people actually did, the best that I could do was just say, "No, we're not going to have an abortion." And that went back and forth for a while until, it was made clear that it didn't really matter what I said or what I did or how I felt. She was determined and she was going to have an abortion. And, and so that's what happened. I fought and I lost. The idea that it wasn't my choice, it didn't have anything to do with me, it didn't matter how I felt, was then compounded by school counselors who helped her as she struggled after the abortion, because it does have negative impacts, not only on men, but also on women.
Yeah.
And that's widely known, although it's disputed by the other side. There's tons and tons and tons of data to show that it has a negative impact on women's mental health. She struggled with her classes after the abortion. And so she went to a counselor. The counselor helped her to waive those classes. She came and told me, "Hey, this is the person I met with, and this is the conversation we had, and this is what happened." So I went in the next day, met with the exact same person, said, "This is the person you met with yesterday. This is the conversation you had. This is the problem. This is the resolution you came with. I'm the other part of that. I am also dealing or struggling just to deal with my classes. And she said, no, this doesn't affect you because you're a man.
Mm.
And so that's what I was left with. And unfortunately, it did affect me. And I ended up failing out of college. I moved home. I failed out of another college 2 more times. And 8 years after the abortion, I was homeless, unemployed, overdosing in a hotel room, and at the end of a 7-year methamphetamine addiction. At no point in time during that 8 years of destructive behavior did I make the connection between the abortion and the feelings that I was having, and
Mhm.
and just this overwhelming desire to cover those feelings up with whatever I could, whether it was drugs or alcohol or partying or women or whatever. And and so there I found myself in December 13th, 2005, overdosing in this hotel room, waiting for the police to come and arrest me for theft from a previous employer, and just praying that God would help me out of that situation, not because I really cared if I lived or died anymore, but because the last thing that I could deal with was the idea that I was going to embarrass my family by
Mm.
being found dead of an overdose in a hotel room. And God heard my prayers, and he answered my prayers. And the next day I woke up and my mind was super clear. And I knew exactly what I needed to do. I went down to this truck I'd been living out of for several years, and I reached my hand behind the driver's seat without even looking, pulled a pamphlet for a treatment center that had been down there for about 2 years,
Mm.
and went and called them, and they said I could get in that day. So then I drove this truck that hadn't had an oil change or maintenance for 5 years, to, 3.5 hours through a national forest, just praying that I'd make it through the forest. I got to Shreveport, Louisiana, where the treatment center was, and the truck started shaking. And I was just praying, just help me make it into the parking lot. And I pulled into the parking lot of the treatment center, and my truck died. And I had to push it into a parking spot. And at that point, it was very clear, hey, I'm safe. This is where I'm supposed to be. I didn't have a phone because I couldn't pay my bill because all my money went to drugs and gambling. And so,
Mhm.
um, there I was with nowhere to go and no way to leave,
Yeah.
and safe. And so in treatment, the counselors, as they're walking me through my life to say, hey, let's figure out how we went from point A to point B,
Yeah.
stopped me and said, hey, I really think we should talk about this. And it was a little surprising to me, I think, because, as I mentioned, never during that period of time did I ever connect the destructive behavior to the loss of my child. But looking at it objectively and looking at it through the counselor's eyes, she was able to see that, my life was on an upward trajectory and nothing happened
Mhm.
until the abortion. And nothing happened after the abortion except just downward spiral. And
Yeah.
so, the counselor in treatment helped me to start to heal. She did a lot of things that I understand that are done during abortion healing retreats. She helped me to name my child. I named him Michael. To write letters asking for forgiveness from my son, from my younger self, forgiving my younger self, forgiving the mother of my child. And really just to begin to heal. And so, um, you know, in addition to being able, or because I guess I was able to begin to heal from the abortion, I was also able to heal from the addictions. And I got out of treatment. I went back to college. I went to law school. I married a woman who I had been pursuing for 7 years, but who God was protecting from me while He was building me into a man she deserved. And started my own law firm, and that's really where that started. Now, the thing that she didn't tell me in treatment was that I was not the only man that was dealing with this, because while she helped me to recognize that it was okay for me to deal with it,
Mhm.
I still thought I was the only one.
Yeah.
I didn't know anybody still who had ever dealt with an abortion. And so, I didn't talk about it. And it was another 8 years after treatment before I talked about it. I was on a retreat, and and on this men's retreat, men were sharing all these stories about their lives. They were sharing the most vulnerable things that they could possibly share. And there was no judgment coming from any of the other men. And I just felt really safe in this place, and thought, hey, I can unload everything for the first time outside of my wife, my parents, siblings, and that counselor.
Mhm.
And I did, and it was very healing. Um, but but what was more profound, I think, is how God showed me that it wasn't about me. Because after I finished sharing my story, I had 3 different men come up to me privately and say, "I haven't told anybody this in 20 years. I haven't told anybody this in 30 years, but I lost a child to abortion when I was 19 or 20." And, some of these men, and this happens every time I speak.
Mhm.
Like every time I speak, a man will come up and say, "I have never told anybody this," because they think they're alone.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's men who, excuse me, who fought against it like I did. Sometimes it's men who pushed for the abortion, and it doesn't matter. What ends up happening is, they at some point they they connect their role as a man, their role in masculinity to protect, to provide, to lead, to serve, and to leave a legacy that honors God. They connect that failure to protect their own child, and that strips something from them. And so they suffer, but they suffer in silence because they think they're alone. And so that's kind of my story as to how abortion affected my life, and then kind of connecting it to, hey, while my story is extreme,
Mhm.
most of these other men didn't deal with an 8-year, um, 7-year methamphetamine addiction, but there's a lot of crazy stories about things that men did do, while they were trying to just shove that feeling down and cover it up and deal with it on their own.
Yeah. Well, how beautiful that you had someone in recovery who was able to pinpoint that as well. Because we did have Gregory Hassick on the podcast a couple of years ago, and he does counseling, and he was talking about how abortion isn't recognized as a trauma in the mental health world. And so, what like he said, a lot of people that come to therapy, they don't think of it as a trauma, and you need counselors who are aware that it is one to be able to help people work through that. So, how beautiful that you had someone in your life in that position who was able to actually say, "Let's look at this particular action," and didn't just dismiss it as normal.
Yeah, most counselors that I talk to, are surprised that happened. Anyone in abortion healing is surprised that that happened. What was that? 21 years ago,
Mhm.
in a drug treatment facility, right? Like, it wasn't like this wasn't an abortion healing retreat, and so I really think God put me in the exact spot He needed me to be faced with the exact people that He put there to help.
Well, that answered my next question, which was how unique do you think your experience was? So, yeah, I guess it is true that, a lot of counselors wouldn't necessarily do that. So, yeah. Um, how do you find that abortion affects men differently than women? Because obviously both struggle with mental health after the fact. Do you find that there's anything in particular how it hurts men that is different or unexpected that someone who's looking at it mostly from the perspective of how it affects women would be surprised by?
Yeah, I think that men are I think it's pretty well known that men are bad at asking for help. Whether it's directions, or something much more significant, right?
Mhm.
And part of that comes from growing up, and being told to be a man, right? To just dust it off, like, dust your shoulders off and get to work. And even when I was 19 and in college, and when I failed at my attempts to convince the mother to have the baby, I did the thing I always do whenever I don't know what the answer is, and I called my dad, who drove 9 hours, met with her mom, um, and ended up offering to adopt the baby. When we failed, though, he said the things that dads say to young men or to boys, and that is, you know, put your head down, push through it, and just get the work done. And so I think what ends up happening is that men shove it down, right?
Mhm.
And when men don't deal with trauma, that comes out and manifests in negative behaviors, and that can be anger, it can be addiction, it can be alcoholism. Support After Abortion did a study on the impact of men and abortion, or the impact of abortion on men. And they identified what they refer to as post-abortive stress disorder. Sorry, post-abortive stress disorder. And I'll send you that link
Mhm.
if you want to link it in the show notes um, to that study, because it's got a lot of good data about men and how across ideological lines, regardless of whether, and I don't want to go too far off for your question, but regardless of whether they fought against it or pushed for it, that there is clear, men are able to recognize that there was a clear negative impact that the
Mhm.
abortion had. I think across ideological lines, it was somewhere between 75 and 89% of men recognized that there were adverse effects. The abortion had adverse effects on their lives, and that they would have benefited from having someone to talk to. So I think that's telling, because what they're saying is, I didn't have someone to talk to, right? Or I didn't take the opportunity to talk to anyone. And I think that's how men really deal with things differently. And I think a big part of that is because men don't talk about abortion. Men don't talk about abortion, right? Like, who are they going to talk to about it? Because as far as they know, most of the time they think that they're alone. We're told over and over and over that this doesn't affect us, that this is a women's issue, that this is about bodily autonomy and women's health. And if it's about bodily autonomy and women's health, then how can I possibly be having a negative impact, from this abortion? And, and, and of course, that's all a lie, right? And that's proof of the lie. There's so much more proof of the lie, but that is one symptom of proof of the lie is that it does adversely affect men. There is a study out of Denmark, which is fascinating, and the reason I say it's fascinating is because not only of the results that came out of it, but because Denmark is not a pro-life country, and this is not a voluntary study. This study out of Denmark was done using socialized medicine, and so maybe the only good thing to come out of socialized medicine is data. So they studied 192,000 men who had lost a child um, various ways. 8,221 of them had lost a child to abortion. Okay,
Mhm.
and they even separated between up to 12 weeks and after 12 weeks. But just using the whole 8221 number, what they found was that men who lost a child to abortion were 4.5 times more likely to seek mental health professionals.
Mhm.
They were, and I'll send you a link to this as well, so that if I misspeak on these numbers, you'll have it. But my recollection is that it's 90% more likely to require antidepressants, 79% more likely to require prescription sleep aids, and 74% more likely to require anti-anxiety medications. Those three numbers, the last two may be backwards, but somewhere between 74 and 79 for each of them. And I think that's really telling that and that abortion affects men.
Yeah.
And there's so much more data as far as how abortion affects women, but I know that's not what you asked me to come here and talk about.
No, I just think it's interesting because a lot of times in pro-life communities, we can focus a lot on the effects of abortion on women, in part because we want the information on the internet so that women who are considering abortion decide not to get an abortion.
Right.
But it's very interesting. Also, just the ways that men and women are gaslit about abortion are just different. With women, it's
Yeah.
told like this is good, it's empowering, it's not going to hurt you at all. This is like the feminist thing to do. And then with men, it's like this doesn't involve you whatsoever. And so, and also men and women are just wired differently mentally, emotionally. So it makes sense that there would be a lot of similarities with the psychological effects, but also some key differences based on their role in the abortion and just their like sex.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And we are gaslit differently. I yesterday was called a sexual predator for standing for life. On a somebody took one of my one of my TikToks and made their own out of it. I think it's called Stitch, where they basically said, I am a sexual predator because I don't want women to kill babies. And that's it though, right? And I talk about that often when I'm talking, is that one of the reasons that it's so hard to get men to be active in the pro-life movement is because of the gaslighting, right? Because of the name calling. I've been called a Nazi for being pro-life. I was actually proud of that one because it took me a really long time to finally be called a Nazi. But pedophile, like I want babies to be born because I'm a pedophile. Um, Actually, I was questioned, and this is something that happens often. If you're pro-life, how many kids have you adopted?
Mm.
And we've adopted 3. I'm always quick to respond on that.
Yeah.
When I said we'd adopted 3, that same person came back and they called me a Nazi and a pedophile. So my answer was not only not good enough, it wasn't what they were looking for, and it angered them to the point where they had to call me names that would allow them to justify violence against me, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that's very typical of what we see, even in a broader sense these days with how people have an inability to disagree, I guess. But most men, when faced with you just want to control women's bodies, you just want to force a 10-year-old rape victim to give birth. Most men are going to think, you know what I would rather do is go play golf.
Mhm.
That'd be way easier than standing here, and speaking boldly for life because I'm getting attacked on things that aren't real. I mean, and most men aren't even in a position, that I'm in to be able to say, look, uh, child rape victims account for less than 0.5% of all abortions, but 99% of the argument that the pro-choice side has, which tells us that they are quick to prey upon these victims of this heinous crime in order to use them as pawns for their argument because they can't justify the other 99.5% of abortions. And anytime you ask them, hey, if I give you that 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 half of a percent, right? If I give you all rape victims have an exception. Will you agree that abortion should be banned in every other case? And of course, 100% of the time they say no. So, which just shows how disingenuous they are and how they're talking. But as a man, if I'm trying to speak for life, because I believe that the unborn are image bearers of God who have the same human dignity and value of the born, and therefore it is wrong to kill them.
Mhm.
And I'm being yelled at that I'm a Nazi, a pedophile, a sexual predator, or that I just want to control women's bodies. It's just easier to say, you know what, I'm going to sit this one out. And I think that's where we've gotten. I think that for 53 years now, since Roe versus Wade, of this repetitive, argument from the other side, that men have just said, you know what, it's just easier to write a check, you know, and let the women do the fight, and to that I say, abortion is a spiritual war. And if we as men have consigned ourselves to sit back and write checks to fund a war that we send our women off to fight, then we are failing in our masculinity. And I
Mhm.
think that's a really big deal. And that's what Men for Life is about.
Yeah.
And that's what my message is typically about, is calling men to masculinity.
How?
I think that's how we change the culture. I think that, um, there's biblical connections, to failed masculinity, in abortion that go all the way back to Genesis.
Yeah.
I don't know how religious you want to get.
Oh,
Uh,
we're a Catholic organization. Feel free to go completely
so
religious.
okay, so if we look at if we look at the connection between or the original or between original sin and abortion is very, very clear if you're willing to look at it. And we go back to Genesis and we look at, first of all, taking into account that this is a spiritual war, right? And in spiritual war, we are told in Ephesians 6:13 that the very first thing that we should put on in the armor of God is the belt of truth, which tells us that truth is the number one weapon against Satan, who is the father of lies, John 8:44. And so Satan being the father of lies, going back to Genesis, and we look at the garden, And the most powerful thing that he has is the separation between the union of God and man and woman. And so we're in the garden, and Satan's telling the woman, Eve, um, you cannot be everything you were created to be. You are not good enough. You're not capable enough. You're not smart enough. You're not strong enough. You cannot be everything you were created to be unless you eat this fruit. You cannot be everything you were created to be unless you get rid of this baby. And you got Adam, who is standing right there, right? That's Genesis 3:6. And we miss that so many times when we're looking at this story. Especially, and I don't know if this is just a Catholic thing, but growing up, like, this is not something that I ever even heard. And, you look at Genesis 3:6, and she turned and gave the fruit to her husband who was with her. Adam was right there the entire time, being passive, being silent, and just watching, probably thinking, her mouth, her choice, her body, her choice. If she makes the decision to eat this fruit, she faces the consequences on her own. The burden is on her. If she gets rid of this baby, if she has an abortion, she faces the consequences by herself. The burden is on her. And what happens after the fall, right? God comes looking in the garden. He doesn't come looking for Eve, he comes looking for Adam. And then
Mm,
if you go all the way back to the or all the way forward to the New Testament, and I don't have this verse memorized, but in one of the letters, it's very clear that um, that 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 original sin was the fault of the first man.
mm,
And that's what the verse says. And so there's not a biblical disagreement there, right? This isn't Eve's fault. This is man's fault. So how could he be at fault for this, right? Well, he's at fault for this, for his silence and passivity, for his failed masculinity. If we are called to protect, to provide, to lead, to serve, and to leave a legacy that honors God, Adam failed to protect his wife. He failed to provide guidance to his wife. He failed to lead. He failed to serve. And in failing to leave a legacy that honors God, he left a legacy of death for all of humanity. And in abortion, that's what we're looking at, right? We're looking at a legacy of death. And that
mhm,
legacy of death, is because of the failure of men. Abortion is the product of failed masculinity, and generally I say that statement first and then make the connection between everything else. But if we look at, the clear line there,
mhm,
men sitting silently on the sidelines for the past 53 years, while 1.162 million of our babies were slaughtered last year. Like, that's a big deal. We don't get to sit this one out. This
mhm.
is this is a fight that we cannot say, "Hey, we're just gonna let the women take care of this." And thank God for women who have stood up and fought for these last 53 years in whatever way they could, and we have, this whole idea of love them both, right? Which comes from the pregnancy center movement. Like, we want to save the baby, but we also want to love the mother. That would not have come from a man ran movement, right? It just wouldn't have. And so I think it's important. I think it's important that we got to the point that we are today. But I think that now we are here, and it's time for us to accept that whether it's us or previous generations of men have failed in this fight. And it's time for us to get into the arena and to fight for life. And that is the mission of Men for Life. The mission of Men for Life is to change the culture by restoring authentic masculinity, equipping men to speak boldly and stand confidently for life, family, and faith.
Amen. No, it's so important. What you're saying makes sense on like the meta level, but what would you say to any men who are listening who were in your shoes, where they did what they could to try to save their child's life and are still suffering for the effects of abortion, who might be listening to it saying, like, that wasn't me. I did everything I could and she still chose to make that decision. Do you have any like anything you would say to men who are hearing this, feeling like they're responsible for their partner's abortion even when they did everything they could to try to stop it?
Yeah, I would say, now what? Like, and that's me being a man talking to men. Like, now what? And that even gets into my story, right? Like, there's two ways that I could have gone about that. I could have continued to be the victim of this situation that happened. That I was I mean, we talk about second victims in abortion all the time, and that's a completely different topic. But I was a second victim. Like, I wanted to save that child's life, and everything that happened, you know, wasn't. I want to make sure I'm clear on how I say this, because I do not believe that men are victims in this. However, I do believe that we can be victims of a situation. The question then becomes, what are we going to do about it? And and look, and God's calling us. We can play it safe. We can sit back. But God doesn't call us to play it safe. He commands us to be courageous. Joshua 1:9, and I think that's where that's what I would say to a man. Like, hey, if this hurts you, if this hurt you, if you lost your child, or if you're the one that pushed for it,
Mhm.
and you recognize that, hey, I failed my child. You have two choices.
Mhm.
You can either live with that and continue repeating that to yourself for the rest of your life, or you can honor that child by doing something about it. And that's when we have to say, it's time to step up and it's time to be a man. Like this is the opportunity as a man to stand up and to fight for life. Like certainly, if there's unresolved feelings, unresolved emotions, I think that there's people that can be incredibly helpful for that. I'm learning about new ones every day. I got information on a new one today. I haven't looked into it enough to be able to share that with you, but one of our board members, Victoria Robinson, um, runs healing retreats,
Okay.
and I know several men who have been through her men's healing retreats,
Mm.
as well as people who have been through her couples healing retreats, and and have gotten kind of to the same degree or even farther in healing than I did when I worked through those exercises in treatment.
Yeah.
She does have a men's retreat coming up in October, so it's called Reassemble is the name of her organization for anyone that is looking to connect with that. You can also email me directly, and I can give you whatever information I have at Shawn@menforlife.org. Um, but beyond that, the real question is now what? Like, just like anything else, like let's just use an example. Let's say and this has happened to other attorneys that I know, where their office manager was embezzling, and all of a sudden they find out that their entire life savings isn't there, and they're in debt, right? And it's not their fault, right? They didn't do anything they actually thought that they were doing the right thing by having somebody be in charge of that. And so it's not their fault. But then the question becomes, now what? Like, are you going to sit and wallow in that, for the rest of your life? Because it sucks. Like it's hard. Like it happened, and it's real. Or are you going to do something about it? And what are you going to do about it? And that's what Men for Life is working on, is providing an opportunity for men to become active and to it's one of the two things we're working on, in providing an opportunity for men to have a community where we become equipped to speak boldly and stand confidently for life. But the big thing is, there's a point where as men, it's a little crazy how much we say, "Hey, suck it up and be a man," and that's not always beneficial.
Mhm.
But I think you have to deal with trauma.
Mhm.
But once you deal with it, now what is the question? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to honor that child that you lost? And that's kind of where I got, because Men for Life was not something that I ever had on my radar. It's not something that I was interested in doing. I actually told them no for 2 years when they asked me if I would come and run the organization. And, I mean, I was practicing law and it was going well, except that I looked at my 5 kids and realized that as good as I was at practicing law, I was really bad at practicing law and being a present husband and being a present father. And those things were more important to me. And so I quit
Mhm.
and had no plans of running a nonprofit until God very clearly said, "You're going to go do this." And and so if that's where God wants me, then that's where I'm going to go.
Yeah.
But more importantly than that, if that's where God wants me, then I'm going to do it in a way that honors my son Michael, because otherwise, we're just victims, and men cannot be perpetual victims. Like things will happen
Mhm.
that we have to overcome, but in overcoming that, we have to do something with it.
Yeah. No, that's so true. How do you find, and you can either answer this from your own personal experience or if that's too uncomfortable for you, just from the broader experience of having talked to different men. who have been in the same shoes. How does a man having an abortion in his past, what impact does that have on a like future relationship and a future marriage? How does that affect that dynamic?
Well, I think that you know, it's really difficult to be whole, you know, it's really difficult to give 100% of yourself, you know, and I think it's, you know, when we look at the Bible, and I don't know if this is a Catholic thing or if it's a Christian thing as a whole, but I've been in Bible studies where, you know, when we get to the verses that talk about wives be subservient to your husband, right? Be
Mhm.
submit or submit to your husbands. There's always a bunch of eye rolling and moaning and groaning, and like we never get into the conversation because we're talking about feminist movement and women's lib. But what's missed is the next part. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. Christ died for the church. And that is what we are called to do as men. The problem is, if we are not whole, whether that trauma comes from the loss of a child to abortion or from anything else
Mhm.
that may have happened in our life, if we are not whole, or anything that we may be going through, you know, at this current moment, like a current addiction, you know, or pornography. I know you said that that's what you and Jacob talked about the last time, or any other disorder that we may be dealing with currently or in our past that we have not quite dealt with. We cannot give ourselves 100% to our wives. We cannot give ourselves 100% to our children. We cannot protect, we cannot provide, we cannot lead, and we cannot serve at the capacity that God has put us here to do if we have not yet dealt with the things that are holding us back. And that's what that is, right? That's something that's holding us back.
No, that makes sense. And then again, this question can just come doesn't have to come from your personal experience, but what advice do you have for men who had an abortion in their past, who are now, like, have a marriage, they have kids, and they don't know how to talk about this topic with their kids in a way that's like I know that, the context for this is that we had Krista Corbella on the podcast 2 years ago,
Yeah.
and she was talking about the impact that abortion has on siblings and how
Yeah.
she's had a bunch of interactions with people who lost siblings to abortion. Sometimes they didn't even know about it and just the emotional, psychological effects that has on kids. What advice do you have for men who are in a position where they're now raising children and they know that these children have lost a sibling to abortion in the past of how to be able to engage with that topic and be there for their kids in, like, this new like, with this knowledge?
Yeah. So just so that I'm clear on this, do the siblings know, or are we presenting it to them? Like which one of
Um,
those are we looking at?
either position. So when
Okay.
Krista was on, she was talking about some people that did know, and then the effects, even if children didn't know, on their like emotional, like how it affected them. It was a little bit more of a broader how abortion affects siblings in general, and it was both
Yeah.
contexts. So you can approach either whichever one you feel most comfortable.
So
Like,
I'm gonna go at it. I just want to make sure that I only speak about things that I'm familiar with and comfortable with. So from the perspective of the sibling,
mhm,
and I appreciate this question because it's not something I've ever thought about. I know Krista and I know her story, but from I've never thought about it from the perspective of my own children.
mhm,
They haven't asked these questions yet, and so you know, I think that the question that I get more often, you know, that's kind of related is, at what age should we talk to kids about this?
mhm,
And so, you know, some people will say when they ask. You know, my situation's a little bit different because I go and speak about this often. I mean, I'm set up in my office doing podcasts about the pro life movement and speaking to people about abortion, you know, every day. And so my kids know what I do, you know, much more than they did when I was practicing law. And actually, like anytime I speak, part of my contract is that they have to pay to bring one of my kids with me. And so they're very familiar with it and they have been for years. But to kind of put that in perspective, you know, when my daughter was 9, we picked her up from her cousin's house, and I don't know what put this in her head, but we picked her up. She got in the car and she said, "How come some people are okay um, killing babies before they're born, but they're not okay killing babies after they're born?" And I didn't know,
mhm.
you know, where she was going to go with that, but I knew it was going to be really good learning experience for all of us, and so we recorded it.
Mhm.
And I just put questions back to her, and asked her questions, and the end result was, the realization to her at 9 years old that some people don't think a baby in the womb is a baby,
Mhm.
right? And her response was, "Well, that's dumb," and that was the end of the conversation, right? It was a 9-year-old conversation.
Yeah.
But I posted it,
Mhm.
and many of the comments that I got were fascinating because they were that people saying, "How dare you indoctrinate this child?" Well, first of all, this is my child. Like,
Yeah.
if anyone's going to indoctrinate my child, it's me.
Right.
Um, but second of all, these same people are the ones that will say, "You just want to force 10-year-old rape victims to give birth." So they're acknowledging that 10-year-olds can get pregnant, can give birth, may have abortions, but are telling me not to talk to my own child about that. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important. Our kids go to a small school, and we guard, what they consume, what their intake is. But the majority of people go to public school. They're going to hear this. They're going to see it on Netflix. They're going to see it on social media. And so I think the idea that they're not taking it in
Mhm.
is naive. And so I would say that how early, should you talk to your kids? Well, as early as you're willing to give them a phone, or let them sit in front of streaming services, without you choosing what they're watching, is how early that you should talk to them about it, because they're already getting it, and they're probably not getting it the way that you want them to get it.
Mhm.
But when it comes to the conversation of, my child dealing with loss of their sibling, you know, um, I feel bad, but I don't really have a good answer for that. I think that's probably better served by someone who has dealt with that. We celebrate the life of my son Michael. Everyone is aware of him, or we celebrate that his existence.
Mhm.
And we honor him, and so that's kind of how we go with that. I wish
Yeah.
I had a better answer for you, but there's a
No, that's a good one though.
can't be an expert in everything.
No, it's a good, perspective though of how you have approached that of giving your children, like, the ability to acknowledge that their sibling was real and that it was a loss and that he existed and not just pretending it didn't happen or saying, like, "That shouldn't bother you. This was in the past." Like,
Right?
you're giving your children a chance to just work through that and process it in their own way without, like, keeping it from them or expecting them to feel a certain way about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Um, just as like a final question, how do you find that like church communities or local communities can be there to best support men who have gone through abortion in the past? Like, is there anything that they can do to reach out to men since you were saying men don't often reach out for help? Or is it one of those things where you just support men who are going through addictions by helping them get therapy and hope that they get therapy that will help them deal with that?
Yeah. So let me start by saying the church is failing. And I say this in hopes that people with churches hear it. The church is failing. I can tell you that in 48 years, I turned 48 like 5 days ago. So in 48 years of going to Catholic school and going to Catholic church and going to mass on vacations, and never once have I ever heard anyone from the altar talk about abortion. I'm
Mhm.
aware that it happens because I talk to people who go to great parishes where the priests don't avoid social issues, but I'm also aware that it's more common that it doesn't happen. And I think that's a failure of the churches. Now, in the work that I do, a good portion, if not most of the people that I work with are not Catholic. And so my understanding is even deeper that this is a failure amongst churches, broadly, right? That they do not talk about abortion. And here are the three objections that churches give as to why they do not talk about abortion. And this will get to your answer to your question. So the objections are, we don't do politics. Um, the second objection is, um, we don't want to lose people. Like, we don't
Mhm.
want to lose people. And then the third one is we don't want to offend people who have had an abortion or have dealt with an abortion. So to the first one, we don't do politics. I just think it's so clear that is That is a failure to look at the reality of the world and of the spiritual battle that we are in, on a broader sense. Because if we're willing to say as a church, we don't do politics, then what we are doing is handing over to Satan the ability to use his minions. We are in a spiritual war. The war is not about flesh and blood, but against the principalities, the authorities, and the rulers of this dark world. And and I think that, when we talk about abortion specifically, we've got the people in government, we've got Planned Parenthood, those would be the principalities, the authorities of this dark world. So we're giving Satan the ability to take any issue that he does not want the church to teach truth about, bring it into politics, and now you can no longer speak about it. So you are literally giving Satan the power to silence you in the word of God when you say, as a priest or pastor, we don't talk about politics. More importantly than that, abortion is not a political issue. It's just an issue that has been brought into politics, right? The second objection that we don't want to lose people, into that, I would say, whose message are you preaching? Because if we look to Jesus, um, in the Gospels, and we look at, trying to remember the verse and I can't, but we look at where Jesus fed the 5,000,
Mhm.
and after he fed the 5,000, he said, unless you eat my body and unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have eternal life, and lost many followers, right? He didn't chase them down. And I think that's really important. He didn't chase down these followers. Like, Jesus taught the truth, and this is the truth. I want you to hear it. I want you to know it. I want you to be able to believe it, and I want you to follow it. But if you choose not to follow it after I share it with you, I'm not coming after you to water down the message. And I think that's really important, And if what we say we're going to lose people, we're talking about donors, then I would have to ask a priest or pastor, did you get into this to build a building? Did you get into this to build a life center? Did you get into this to do all these great things so that you can put your name on a plaque on a wall in a facility? Or did you get into this because you're teaching the truth? And
Mhm.
if you're getting into this to teach the truth, then build your church down. Like, build it with the truth. Let people leave, because this isn't about money. Like, this is about truth. This is about salvation. This is about eternal salvation, which is so much more valuable than any building you can build, or any service that you may be able to provide. And then the third objection, and this kind of gets to the heart of your question, is, we don't want to offend people who have had abortions. Well, people who have had abortions, who are up to 40% of the people sitting in the pews, like, are hurting. They're hurting, and if you don't preach about abortion from the sense that, there's a couple of things going on. Number one, when you don't talk about abortion, people are hearing that it's not an important issue and it's not something the church cares about. But number two, you're not giving them a message of hope and redemption through Jesus Christ and forgiveness. And these people are sitting there and they're hearing all these things that they can be forgiven for. And maybe even a generalization that you can be forgiven for everything, but what's not spoken is heard. And they're not hearing that even abortion, even when you killed your own child, you can find forgiveness through Jesus Christ. And so the silence on abortion to the people who have experienced it is more offensive than anything that they could say in truth. And so I think that the churches need to have like a real recognition of, where they are missing the boat on this,
Mhm.
and putting it off on pregnancy centers, and things like that. And they need to, it's not enough for the bishop or the priest to show up to the march, right?
Mhm.
But not to say anything else for the rest of the year. Like, that's a failure. Anybody can show up for a march. Now you're just doing it for social reasons, and the job is not social. The job is pastoral. And so if, once they have that recognition,
Mhm.
then I think there are services that can be put in place. And of course, the church is the first place people should be able to go, but you have to be willing as a priest or a pastor to say from the altar, there is forgiveness through Jesus Christ. There is redemption through the blood of Jesus Christ, even if you have had an abortion, and it can be as part of a greater conversation. even if you have been in addiction, even if you have cheated on your wife, even if, whatever, but even if you have had an abortion has to be a part of that. And
Yeah.
once you do that, then you open the door for people to be able to come up and say, "Hey, how?"
Yeah.
And that gives you the opportunity to, to provide that. I had the opportunity. I practiced divorce law for 10 years, and I had an opportunity to do what's called the Catholic Divorce Survival Guide, with another friend of mine who's in ministry. Um, and we served, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen people who were going through a divorce or had gone through a divorce, and helping them to connect their experiences to healing and forgiveness, and what this meant as a Catholic. Um, and I think that there are ways that the church, whether Catholic or any other denomination, can really serve people through programs like that. And I think that's what church is for, right? Church is for healing, and because we're all broken.
Mhm.
And so, I think that first the church has to be able to recognize their failure in the silence on this issue. But once they open that door, I think that they can find that there's a great opportunity to help people heal.
Yeah. Well, and to tie it back to your story as well, you were saying that throughout all your addiction, no, it never occurred, like, it didn't connect that the abortion was what caused it. So the more that churches and, like, the more it's commonly known that abortion causes these emotional effects and has this negative impact, you're almost giving people permission to seek help for something that could be hurting that they may not have even realized is what's causing that hurt.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Shawn. And could you just share with our audience the resources that Men for Life has and where they can find you? I know that you have a podcast. So there was some,
Yes.
you and I were talking before the show. There's some overlapping guests between our show and yours. So it was nice to
Yeah.
see familiar names on it.
So yes, we do the Men for Life podcast. I actually do two different podcasts. One is called Into the Arena. It's all on our YouTube page, but I just separated them. One is the Into the Arena is more about men and biblical masculinity, and just current issues. But we also talk about pro life issues regularly because both of us are in that in that space. And then the Men for Life podcast, where I interview people who are active in the pro life movement who have been impacted by abortion. I've had former abortionists, other OBGYNs who have done fetal surgery in the womb, um, and just people who, men and women both, who have been impacted by abortion. Men for Life currently has two main initiatives. The first is a fatherhood program for pregnancy centers. We know that from data from the Vitae Foundation. We know that, and I'll also give you a link to their to the findings of their new study. They just completed a study on men and abortion, which may
Perfect.
be helpful.
Yeah.
But the Vitae Foundation found that 97% of men who see an ultrasound and go through a fatherhood program choose life, and that's higher than any number we have with women. And
Yeah.
so that's telling on several issues, and there's a lot of data to back up that men are pro life and want to have families. I think right now, Gallup poll from last year shows 54% of American men identify as pro life, 41% of American men identify as pro choice. So we have the numbers,
Mhm.
but we've been shoved to the sidelines. And so it's important to do something with those numbers. So the fatherhood program will help these young men as they enter the pregnancy center, to not only save that baby, but to build them into good men through principles of biblical masculinity.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the second initiative that we're working on is called the Men for Life Arena, which is an online membership community for our donors to provide them an opportunity to become equipped, to learn, to communicate with other men and women,
Mhm.
to learn pro life apologetics, to be able to speak confidently and stand boldly for life, or speak boldly and stand confidently for life, or both.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and I'll obviously put the links to Men for Life's website and your YouTube channel in the description as well, so people can check that out.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing your story today, Shawn.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate it as well. And to all of our audience, please like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video or leave us a 5-star review. And as always, keep on living the culture of life. God bless.